She spent her entire life building that home only, to be locked in its basement by the very son she had given birth to. Not with chains or locks, but with papers she couldn't understand, sweet words she had trusted, and the silence of a man who had called her mother for 40 years. If you think the worst thing that can happen to an elderly woman is being forgotten, then you haven't heard Evelyn Harper's story. Hit the follow button now so you don't miss future stories. And please like and comment with your city or country below so I know where in the world this story has touched your heart. I was 67 years old the first time I slept on a cot in my own basement. Not a guest room, not a spare bedroom down the hall. A basement the kind that smells like old insulation and damp concrete, where spiders build their webs in the corners and the light flickers when the furnace kicks on. The kind of place where you store the things you no longer want to look at. That night, I lay there in the dark listening to my son's footsteps moving across the floor above me. Slow, unhurried, comfortable footsteps. The footsteps of a man who believed he had already won. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened. I was not a weak woman. I was not the kind of person who let things slide or smiled through her teeth when she should have been screaming. I built that house with my own hands, not literally, but in every way that mattered. Paid the mortgage for 31 years. I painted every room. I planted the garden in the backyard, the one with the rose bushes along the fence that came back every spring, no matter how bad the winter had been. That house was mine. Every single square foot of it was mine. And then I made the worst mistake of my life. I trusted my son. It didn't start out looking like a mistake. That's the thing nobody tells you about betrayal. It never arrives wearing its real face. It comes dressed up as help, as love, as concern. It knocks on your door with a casserole dish and a warm smile and says, "Mom, we just want to make sure you're okay." Caleb was 41 when he and his wife Vanessa first started coming around more often. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. He'd had a rough couple of years, a failed business venture, some credit trouble he never fully explained to me, the kind of vague financial fog that young couples sometimes walk into when they live beyond their means. I hadn't pushed him for details. That wasn't my style. I raised him to handle his own problems, and I assumed he was doing that. What I didn't know was that while I was giving him the benefit of the doubt, he was doing the math on my property. The house was worth close to $480,000 by then. The neighborhood had gone up significantly over the decades. The lot alone was valuable. I knew it. Of course, I wasn't naive about real estate. But I had never thought of my home as an asset to be liquidated. It was where I lived. It was where I intended to keep living until I couldn't anymore. "Mom, you really should let us help you manage things," Caleb said one Sunday afternoon in late October. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the same table I'd had since before he was born. Vanessa was beside him, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, her expression arranged into something that looked like worry. "What things?" I asked. "Just everything." He spread his hands open like the word was too obvious to explain. "The bills, the property taxes, the maintenance. This is a lot of house for one person, Mom. I've managed it alone for 15 years, I said. Since your father passed. I think I'm doing fine." Vanessa looked at Caleb. One of those looks that married people have, the kind that carries an entire conversation in half a second. I noticed it. I filed it away. "We're not saying you're not capable," she said, her voice careful, modulated, the way a person speaks when they've rehearsed. "We're just saying you shouldn't have to carry all of this alone. We want to be here for you." I looked at her, this woman my son had married 8 years ago, this woman with her sharp haircut and her expensive shoes, who had never once called me without wanting something, and I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not suspicion exactly, more like a premonition, like the way the air changes right before a storm rolls in. "I'll think about it," I said. I should have said no. I should have said thank you, but I have everything under control and changed the subject to something safe, something neutral. But I was 67 and I was tired. And there were things around the house that did need attention, things I had been putting off because the estimates felt too high and the contractors felt unreliable. And Caleb was my son. He was the person I had carried inside my body, the person I had stayed up with through 3 rounds of strep throat and 2 broken bones and 1 very bad year in high school that I had never told anyone about. How do you tell yourself not to trust that? So I said I'd think about it, and that was the beginning of the end. The changes were incremental. That's how it works, I understand that now. If someone takes everything from you all at once, you fight back. You call a lawyer, you call the police, you call a neighbor. But if someone takes things away one small piece at a time, slowly enough that each individual loss seems manageable, seems reasonable, seems temporary, you don't fight back. You adjust. You tell yourself you're being practical. First, it was the utility accounts. Caleb's said he'd take over paying them so I didn't have to worry about late fees. I had never paid a bill late in my life, but I let him do it anyway because it seemed easier. He asked for access to my online banking portal to set up automatic transfers. I gave it to him. Then it was the property insurance. He said he'd found me a better rate with a different company, and he handled the switch. All I had to do was sign the new policy documents. I signed them. Then there was a conversation about estate planning, my existing will, what would happen to the property after I was gone, what made the most sense from a tax perspective. I told him I didn't need to rush those decisions. He said he wasn't rushing me. He was protecting me. He brought in a man who introduced himself as a financial advisor, a balding man with a gray suit and a briefcase who sat across from me at my kitchen table and used words like probate and transfer of ownership and avoiding unnecessary burden on your heirs until my head was swimming. I signed something that day. I'm not entirely sure what. I remember the pen in my hand. I remember the man pointing to a line and saying, "Just here, Mrs. Harper, and we'll get out of your way." I remember Vanessa standing by the window and the way she turned her face away from me when I looked up. That should have been the moment I stopped. That turned away face. But it wasn't. 3 months after that first Sunday conversation in the kitchen, Caleb sat me down and told me he and Vanessa were going to move in. Move in, I repeated. Just temporarily, he said. The lease on our apartment ended and the new place we wanted fell through. It's only going to be a few months, Mom. We'll be out of your hair before spring. I looked around my living room, my furniture, my photographs on the walls, the throw blanket my sister had crocheted for me, folded over the arm of the couch, and I felt something seize up in my chest. A deep instinctive resistance, the kind that lives below words, below reason. Caleb, I said slowly, this is my home, and you're my mother. He said it like it was the answer to something, like it resolved the question before it had even been fully asked. We'll pay our share of expenses. It'll actually save you money, if you think about it. What could I say? He was my son. He had nowhere to go. Or so I believed. They moved in the first week of November, and within 2 weeks I understood that something had shifted in the architecture of the house itself. Not structurally, not in the walls or the floors, but in the way power moves through a space, the way presence claims territory. Caleb and Vanessa spread into the house the way water spreads into a crack. Naturally, inevitably, as though they had always been there, and I was the one who had arrived late. Vanessa rearranged the kitchen. She said she was just reorganizing, but she moved things I had kept in the same places for 20 years. My spices, my good dishes, the drawer where I kept the scissors and the tape and the birthday candles. She moved all of it. And when I asked her where things had gone, she explained the new system to me with the bright, careful patience of someone explaining things to a child. Caleb started taking calls in the study, my study, the room where I paid bills and kept files, and had my small desk where I wrote letters by hand because I had always preferred it. He asked if he could use it during business hours. I said yes. Within a week, he was in there every night until midnight. I started spending more time in the kitchen, then in my bedroom, then mostly in my bedroom. My world was shrinking. I could feel it shrinking. But every time I tried to articulate the feeling to say, something is wrong here, something is not right, I couldn't find the edges of it. It was too diffuse, too plausible, too easy to explain away. Until the night I heard the conversation I was never supposed to hear. It was late February, almost 4 months after they'd moved in. I had come downstairs for a glass of water. My throat was dry, and I hadn't been sleeping well. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs because the light was on in the study, and the door was open a crack, and I could hear their voices, low and urgent, the way people talk, when they believe no one is listening. The transfer went through, Caleb said. All of it. All of it? Vanessa's voice. Sharper. The account, the property title, everything we set up with Graydon is in place. As far as the county records go, we're the primary owners. Pause. Then Vanessa said, what about the lawyer she used when she bought the place? He retired, the firm closed. There's no one to flag anything. And she doesn't know? A sound I couldn't identify. maybe a chair shifting, maybe Caleb exhaling through his nose the way he did when he was impatient. She signed what she signed. I was there. She doesn't understand what half of those documents mean. I stood at the bottom of the stairs with my hand on the newel post and the cold from the floor coming up through my socks, and I felt my entire body go still. Not shocked, not in the way you expect shock to feel, the way it floors you. This was something deeper, something quieter. It was the feeling of a suspicion that had lived inside you for months, finally being confirmed, and instead of relief, there's just this vast, cold clarity. They had stolen my house. Not in some gray, ambiguous, open to interpretation way. They had deliberately, systematically manipulated me into signing over my property. My son had sat across the kitchen table from me and called it estate planning, and brought in a man with a briefcase and watched me sign my home away. I went back upstairs without the water. I lay down on my bed in the dark and I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and I thought very carefully about what to do next. I didn't confront them the next morning. I know some people would have. I know some people, faced with what I had just learned, would have come down those stairs at breakfast and put everything on the table, the conversation they'd overheard, the documents they'd signed, all of it. I understand that impulse. I felt it. But I had raised a son who was smarter than he looked, and I had been married to a man for 34 years who had always said, Evelyn, you think 3 steps ahead of everyone in the room, and that's why nobody can ever really catch you. My husband had been wrong about a lot of things, but he had not been wrong about that. I needed proof. Real proof. Not just what I'd heard through a cracked door, something that would stand up. Something that couldn't be explained away or dismissed as a confused old woman misunderstanding a legal process. So I did something Caleb and Vanessa never anticipated. I started looking. I had years of records in the basement filing boxes going back 2 decades, organized in my own system. Not always logical to someone else, but perfectly clear to me. Every mortgage statement, every insurance document, every home improvement receipt, every tax record. I had been meticulous because that was how my father had raised me, and because I had learned young that paperwork was the thing that saved you when everything else fell apart. I told Caleb I thought I should move some of my storage down to the basement. He seemed relieved one more room cleared for them, one less space I occupied. He even helped me carry boxes down, never thinking to look inside them. And in that basement, surrounded by the evidence of my own life, I began building my case. I was not a helpless old woman. I was a woman with a filing system and a very good memory and 31 years of receipts. And I had nothing left to lose. The basement smelled like cedar and old paper, and something faintly metallic that I could never quite identify. I had spent the first 3 days down there telling myself it was temporary, that I was simply organizing, simply creating a workspace for myself while I figured out what to do next. But by the 4th day, when Vanessa knocked on the basement door and told me, in that carefully neutral voice she used, when she wanted to sound reasonable, that they were going to need my bedroom for a home office, I understood that temporary had already become something else entirely. Your bedroom, I said. I was standing at the bottom of the stairs looking up at her, and the angle of it, me below, her above, her hand resting on the doorframe like she owned it, which apparently she now believed she did, was not lost on me. It gets the best morning light, she said. And Caleb needs a proper space to work. We thought you'd be more comfortable down here anyway, since you're already set up. Already set up. As though I had chosen this. As though I had looked at the exposed pipes running across the ceiling and the single bare bulb on a pull chain and thought, yes, this is exactly where I want to spend my retirement. I did not argue with her. This was a deliberate decision, not a failure of nerve. I had learned something important in the first weeks of their occupation of my house. Every time I pushed back openly, every time I said, wait, that's not right, or I don't think that's fair, Caleb would appear within minutes, calm and measured, and he would say something like, Mom, you're getting upset over nothing, or Mom, you've been under a lot of stress. Maybe you should rest. He had a talent for making my legitimate grievances sound like symptoms of something wrong with me. And Vanessa would stand slightly behind him with that look on her face, not quite pity, not quite contempt, somewhere in the uncomfortable middle, and I would feel the ground shifting under me, feel my own certainty eroding. So I had stopped arguing. I had stopped reacting. I had made myself into something they didn't think to watch too carefully. That's fine, I told Vanessa. I'll make do. She looked almost surprised. She had expected resistance. When she didn't get it, something flickered across her face: relief, maybe, or something close to disappointment. The way people sometimes feel when they've braced for a fight and the other person simply steps aside. She nodded once and pulled the door closed. I turned back to my boxes. I made do. What they didn't understand, what they had never understood about me, not really, was that I had spent the better part of 7 decades making do. I had grown up in a house with 1 bathroom and 4 children, and a father who worked double shifts at a machine shop. I had buried a husband and raised a son and managed a property alone through 2 recessions and one stretch of 3 months where I was so short on money that I ate oatmeal for dinner 4 nights a week and told no one. I was not fragile. I had never been fragile. I had simply, over the years, allowed the people around me to forget that. Caleb had forgotten. Vanessa had never known to begin with, and that was the first real advantage I had. The second advantage was the boxes. I had 32 filing boxes in that basement. 32 boxes organized by year and category, going back to 1991. Most people, when they move into a house, keep maybe 5 years of records before they start shredding. I had kept everything. My financial advisor, the real one, the woman named Patricia Osi, who had helped me manage my retirement accounts before she moved her practice to another city, had always teased me about it. "Evelyn, you could survive a federal audit with what you've got in those boxes," she used to say. I had laughed at the time. I was not laughing now. I was grateful. I started with the documents I remembered signing over the past several months. I could recall 3 separate occasions when paperwork had been placed in front of me: the insurance policy switch, the meeting with the gray-suited man Caleb had called a financial advisor, and one other occasion in late December when Vanessa had brought me a folder and said it was something to do with property tax restructuring. I had been tired that day. I had a headache. I had signed where she pointed without reading carefully, and I had hated myself for it ever since. I needed to find out exactly what I had signed. And more importantly, I needed to find out what those documents had replaced. I had my original mortgage documents from 1993. I had the deed. I had the title insurance policy. I had every single property tax receipt going back 30 years. What I needed now was to understand the gap, the space between what I knew I owned and what Caleb was now claiming to own, and how they had moved the legal reality from one to the other. This was not something I could figure out alone. I knew that. I was intelligent and I was organized, but I was not a lawyer, and the language in property documents was specifically designed to be impenetrable to people who were not lawyers. I needed help from someone I could trust, absolutely someone Caleb didn't know, someone who had no connection to the financial advisor or anyone else in the web of people he had brought into my life over the past year. Problem was that I was living in my basement, and my phone was the one Caleb had purchased for me 2 years ago, a gift he had presented with great ceremony, and which I now had reason to believe he might be monitoring. I did not know this for certain, but I had noticed, a few weeks earlier, that he seemed to know things he shouldn't have known: a conversation I'd had with a neighbor, a phone call I'd made to my dentist's office to reschedule an appointment. Small things. The kind of things that individually meant nothing, but collectively formed a pattern. I started taking walks. Every morning, just after 8, I put on my coat and my good walking shoes, and I went out the front door, and I walked for 45 minutes through the neighborhood. Caleb and Vanessa were always still asleep. They kept late hours, the 2 of them up until midnight or 1 in the morning, sleeping until 9 or 10. This was the one piece of luck in an otherwise unlucky situation. They were not morning people, and I had always been. On the 3rd walk, I stopped at the public library on Garfield Street. It was a 10-minute detour from my usual route, and I had timed it deliberately. The library opened at 8:30. I was there when the doors unlocked. I used one of the public computers to search for property attorneys in the county specifically, attorneys who specialized in elder law and property disputes. I wrote 3 names and phone numbers on a piece of paper torn from a small notebook I'd brought in my coat pocket. Then I folded the paper and tucked it into my shoe. It felt ridiculous. It felt like something out of a spy novel. But the feeling of ridiculous was significantly preferable to the feeling of being caught. On the way home, I stopped at the pharmacy on the corner, and there's their payphone. Yes, they still had one. Ancient and slightly sticky, mounted on the wall near the back. by the blood pressure machines, and I called the first number on my list. A woman answered on the third ring. Her name, she said, was Margaret Okafor, and she had been practicing elder law and property litigation for 22 years. I need help, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. I think my son has stolen my house. There was a brief silence. Not the silence of surprise, more the silence of a person who has heard this particular sentence before and is organizing their response carefully. Tell me what happened, she said. I told her. Standing at the back of the pharmacy with the blood pressure machine humming softly beside me, and the smell of antiseptic in the air, I told Margaret Okafor everything. The Sunday conversation in the kitchen, the documents I'd signed, the conversation I'd overheard in February, the basement, the bedroom that was now a home office, all of it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Mrs. Harper, do you have your original deed? Yes. Do you have documentation of your mortgage payments going back to the beginning? 31 years of them. Another pause. You come see me? Not easily, I said. My son and his wife are in my house most of the time. I have a morning window, maybe an hour. Then we'll use your morning window, she said. Can you come Thursday? I said yes. I wrote her address on the same piece of paper in my shoe. Then I bought a bottle of hand lotion. I didn't need, so I had a reason to have been in the pharmacy, and I walked home. Caleb was awake when I got back, standing in the kitchen in his bathrobe with a coffee mug, looking vaguely bleary. You were out early, he said. I went for a walk, I said, like I do every morning. He looked at me for a moment with that evaluating expression he'd developed over the past few months, not quite suspicion, but a kind of low-level monitoring, the way you watch something you think is contained but aren't entirely certain about. Then he shrugged and turned back to his coffee. Don't overdo it, he said. Cold out. I'm aware of the weather, Caleb, I said. I've been managing it for 67 years. He didn't answer. I went downstairs. I sat on the edge of my cot in the basement, and I pressed my hands together in my lap to stop them from shaking. Not from fear, from something that was not quite rage and not quite grief, but lived in the space between them, the particular anguish of a mother who looks at her adult child and can no longer find the person she raised inside him. Where had he gone? That small boy who used to bring me dandelions from the backyard and call them flowers. The teenager who had cried, genuinely cried, when the family dog died, and who had sat with me in the kitchen at midnight while I made hot chocolate and we talked about whether animals had souls. The young man who had called me from college every Sunday without fail, not because I asked him to, but because he said he just liked hearing my voice. When did he become this? I didn't know. And I didn't have the luxury of spending time trying to figure it out. Thursday morning came. I got up at 7, dressed carefully, put my important documents, the originals, the ones I most needed, into a large envelope that I slid into a canvas tote bag under a folded jacket. I walked to Margaret Okafor's office, which was 12 minutes from my house on foot, a brick building on a street corner, with a small, discreet sign beside the door. She was not what I had pictured from her voice. She was younger than I expected, mid-40s maybe, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a desk covered in organized piles of folders, and a directness in her manner that I immediately trusted. She shook my hand firmly and gestured to the chair across from her desk and said, "Show me what you brought." I showed her. She went through the documents methodically, carefully, without rushing. She asked questions. Precise, pointed questions. When did you sign this? Was anyone else in the room? Did you receive a copy? Did this person show you their credentials? I answered everything I could, admitted when I didn't know, and watched her face for clues about how bad it was. It was bad. The deed transfer, she said, not looking up from the paper in her hands, appears to have been filed with the county about 6 weeks ago. The signature on this is yours, Mrs. Harper. It was done under what I would characterize as highly questionable circumstances. She set the page down and looked at me over her reading glasses. Were you ever advised to have independent legal counsel review these documents before you signed them? No. Were you told what you were signing in plain language? No. There was a lot of terminology. The man who presented the documents, Caleb, called him a financial advisor. He just pointed to the signature lines. Margaret Okafor wrote something in her notepad. Do you know this man's name? Great, and I said. I heard Caleb say it. I don't know his last name or his credentials. She wrote that down too. Then she set her pen down and folded her hands on the desk in front of her and looked at me with the kind of directness that is actually a form of respect. The kind that doesn't soften the truth because it assumes you can handle it. Mrs. Harper, what your son and his wife appear to have done is execute a fraudulent property transfer using documents you signed without informed consent. This is not a gray area. This is potentially criminal, and it is absolutely grounds for legal action. She paused. Question is evidence. We need to be able to demonstrate that you did not willingly and knowingly surrender your property. The documents alone, combined with your account of how they were presented to you, give us a foundation. But the more supporting evidence you can gather, the stronger your position. What kind of evidence? I asked. Financial records showing the pattern of control over your accounts. Any communications texts, emails, voicemails that demonstrate coercive behavior or misrepresentation. Witness testimony if any neighbors or friends observed anything. And anything you can find about this man Graydon. Who he is. Whether he's a licensed professional, who he works for. I nodded slowly. My mind was already moving, already cataloging, already thinking about the boxes in my basement, and the conversations I had half-heard and the pieces I had been collecting without fully understanding what I was collecting them for. I have recs going back 30 years, I said. I have mortgage statements, tax documents, insurance policies, all the originals. And I paused, choosing the word carefully. I have been keeping notes since February. Everything I've observed with dates and times. Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise exactly. More like the adjustment a person makes when they realize the situation is different from what they assumed better, in this case. Stronger. Good, she said simply. Keep doing that. And Mrs. Harper, she hesitated, which was the first time she had hesitated. Are you safe in that house? I thought about the basement, the pull-chain light bulb, the cot, the folded blanket that had been my mother's. Caleb's footsteps above me. Vanessa's voice through the ceiling. They haven't hurt me physically, I said carefully. They've just reduced me, piece by piece. Made me smaller and smaller until I fit in a space they felt comfortable putting me in. She held my gaze. That's a form of harm too, I know, I said. I'm aware of that now. I walked home with her card in my shoe alongside the piece of paper with her address, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't hope exactly. Hope felt too light, too easy for what I was carrying. It was more like the feeling of solid ground under your feet after a long stretch of ice. The sense that the surface you were standing on would hold. I needed it to hold. Because what I found in the boxes that next week made everything worse before it could get better. I had known the property transfer was the center of it, the main theft, the most obvious violation. What I had not known was that it was not the only one. Going through my financial records with the meticulous attention I had been trained since childhood to give to numbers, I found a pattern of withdrawals from my savings account that I could not account for. They were not large, individual amounts, nothing that would have set off an alarm on its own. $80 here, $140 there, $220 in a single week in January. But they had been happening consistently since October, which was almost exactly when Caleb had taken over managing the utility accounts and gained access to my banking portal. I added them up 3 times because I did not trust myself to believe the total the first 2 times. $11,460. Gone. Moved somewhere in increments small enough to avoid scrutiny over a period of 4 months. I sat in the basement with my mother's blanket around my shoulders and my financial records spread across the concrete floor and the pull-chain light bulb doing its inadequate best against the dark, and I felt harden in the center of me. Not anger, I was past the sharp, reactive kind of anger by then. This was something cooler and more durable. The kind of resolve that doesn't burn hot and exhaust itself. The kind that settles in and stays. They had taken my house. They had taken my savings. They had taken my bedroom, my study, my kitchen, my sense of safety in my own home. They had reduced me to a cot in a basement and told themselves I was certain of this, that I was too old and too confused and too powerless to do anything about it. I thought about Caleb's face at the kitchen table all those months ago, so earnest, so concerned, telling me he just wanted to help. I thought about Vanessa's hand on the doorframe. I thought about the gray-suited man who had called himself a financial advisor and pointed to the signature lines and said, "Just here, Mrs. Harper, and we'll get out of your way." I picked up my notebook and I kept writing. Every conversation I could recall, with as much verbatim accuracy as my memory would allow. Every date, every document, every withdrawal I had now identified. The name Graydon, the way Caleb had said it, everything we set up with Graydon is in place with the easy familiarity of someone naming a business partner, not someone he'd hired casually. Who was Graydon? The question bothered me in the specific way that an incomplete equation bothers a person who cannot rest until it resolves. I needed his last name. I needed to know what he was and what role he had actually played in the transfer. The answer came from an unexpected direction. I had a neighbor, a woman named Dolores Fitch, 72 years old, who had lived 3 houses down from me for 16 years and who I had always liked without us being particularly close. We were the kind of neighbors who wave across the yard, who bring each other vegetables from the garden in summer, who exchange small favors without keeping score. I had not seen much of Dolores since Caleb and Vanessa moved in. I had retreated inward, pulled my world down to the size of the basement, and I had let my small social connections atrophy, the way you let things atrophy when you're trying to survive. On a Thursday morning in late March, Dolores was checking her mailbox when I came out for my walk. She looked up, and the expression on her face when she saw me a flash of something too concerned. To be casual told me that whatever I thought I was hiding, I was not hiding as well as I believed. "Evelyn," she said, "I was hoping I'd run into you." We stood on the sidewalk in the thin spring light, and Dolores told me that she had noticed things. She had seen the moving truck when Caleb and Vanessa arrived. She had seen the lights on in my bedroom at all hours, not my bedroom hours. She had seen Vanessa coming and going with shopping bags, and a new car parked in my driveway, a sleek, dark SUV that had not been there before. She had noticed that I had not been at the neighborhood association meeting in February, which I had attended faithfully for 11 years. "I knocked on your door 2 weeks ago," she said. That woman answered. "She told me you weren't available." I felt the cold run through me again. Not unavailable. I had been in the basement 12 feet below the front door, and Vanessa had told my neighbor of 16 years that I was not available. "Dolores," I said, "did Caleb ever mention a man named Graydon to you? Or did you ever see someone come to the house middle-aged, gray suit, balding?" She looked at me strangely. Then she said, "I know a Graydon. Dennis Graydon. He's a notary, used to be a paralegal, I think, but he lost his license years ago for something. My nephew dealt with him when he was buying his first house and had a very bad experience." She paused. "Why are you asking about him?" "A notary. Not a financial advisor. A man who had presented himself with a briefcase and a professional manner and a title that Caleb had invented for him, and who was in fact a former paralegal who had lost his professional license, sitting across from a 67-year-old woman at her kitchen table and watching her sign documents he had no legitimate authority to oversee." The picture became complete. Not fully, there were still pieces I didn't have, still questions I couldn't answer. The shape of it was clear now. The shape was unmistakable. I squeezed Dolores' hand. "Would you be willing to talk to a lawyer?" I asked her. "About what you've seen. It might be important." She looked at me for a long moment, this woman I had waved to across the yard for 16 years. This woman who had brought me zucchini from her garden, and whose name I had almost let slip away from me in the fog of the past few months. "Yes," she said, without hesitation. "Whatever you need." I walked home faster than usual. My heart was moving in a way I hadn't felt in a long time, not panic, not fear. Purpose. The specific forward momentum of someone who has finally identified the ground they're going to fight on. In the basement, I pulled out my notebook and kept writing. I pulled out the financial records and organized them by date, most recent on top. I made a separate list of every piece of evidence I had and marked what was confirmed and what still needed verification. I was methodical. I was unhurried, and I was, for the first time in months, something close to calm. Caleb had made a fundamental error. It was the same error that people who underestimate others always make. He had confused my silence for passivity. He had confused my compliance for acceptance. He had looked at a woman in a basement and seen someone diminished, someone defeated, someone who had accepted the story he was telling about her. He had not understood, and this was his real mistake, the one that would cost him everything, that I was not in that basement because I had given up. I was in that basement because it was the only place in the house where I could work without being watched. They had put me down there to get me out of the way. Instead, they had given me the room where I was building the case that would take everything back. Above me, I could hear them moving around. The sound of Vanessa's voice on the phone, bright and social. The sound of Caleb's laughter at something on his laptop. The sounds of two people who believed they had already won, who had stopped being careful because they saw nothing left to be careful about. I wrote another page of notes. I added Dolores Fitch's name and what she had told me. I added Dennis Graydon's name and what Dolores had said about his background. I underlined lost his license twice and wrote 3 question marks beside it. Then I turned to a fresh page and I started writing something new, a timeline, starting from the first Sunday in October when Caleb and Vanessa had sat across from me at my kitchen table with their warm expressions and their careful words, all the way forward to this moment, this basement, this pull chain light in the dark. Every step, every document, every small theft, every lie. I was not finished, not by a long way, but I was ready. The timeline I had been building across those notebook pages was now 14 pages long. 14 pages of dates, names, amounts, conversations, and observations written in my careful schoolteacher's handwriting, the kind my 3rd grade teacher had drilled into me, with a patience I had not appreciated until I was much older. Every entry was specific. Every entry was verifiable against at least one other piece of documentation. Margaret Okafor had told me on my second visit to her office that the timeline was, in her words, remarkably thorough, and I had felt something twist uncomfortably in my chest at the compliment, because the only reason it was so thorough was that I had been living inside the situation it described, cataloging my own humiliation in real time. That was the thing nobody prepared you for. Not the theft itself. The theft was, in a terrible way, almost clean in its simplicity. They wanted what I had. They took it. They used legal language to make it look legitimate. That part, as devastating as it was, had a comprehensible shape. What I had not been prepared for was the relentlessness of the daily diminishment. The way that living as a guest in my own home, beneath my own home, technically wore at something fundamental inside me. Not my resolve. My resolve had hardened into something I barely recognized, something that felt less like emotion and more like geology. But it wore at the softer parts, the parts that remembered. April had arrived, and with it a kind of false warmth that Pennsylvania springs specialize in, bright and promising in the mornings, cold enough by late afternoon to make you regret having taken off your coat. I had taken to watching the backyard garden from the single basement window that sat just above ground level, a small rectangular pane that gave me a worm's eye view of the rose bushes along the fence. They were starting to bud. Every year, no matter what the winter had done, those roses came back. My husband Robert had planted them the spring before he got sick, and they had survived every hard season since, and watching them come back now felt like the most important thing I had witnessed in months. Upstairs, life continued in the version that Caleb and Vanessa had constructed over my own. They had people over now, regularly. On a Friday night in early April, I lay on my cot and listened to the sound of a dinner party happening directly above me, the clink of glasses, bursts of laughter, the particular self-congratulatory sound of people who believe they have arrived somewhere worth celebrating. I recognized Caleb's social laugh, the one he used with people he wanted to impress, louder than his real laugh and about 4 degrees more charming. I had not heard his real laugh in months, maybe years if I was honest. I pressed my hand flat against the ceiling, the floor above me, and I stayed very still, and I listened. The place is worth at least $510 now, maybe more if we stage it right. I caught the sentence through the floor and the layers of subfloor and old carpet between us, partial and distorted but unmistakable in its meaning. $510,000. They were already discussing the sale price. I sat up. I had known this was coming. Margaret had warned me in our last meeting that the most urgent risk was a sale, that once the property transferred to a third-party buyer in good faith, the legal process of reclaiming it became significantly more complicated, significantly more expensive, and significantly less certain in its outcome. She had filed a preliminary injunction 3 weeks ago, a legal instrument designed to prevent any sale of the property while the dispute was under review. But injunctions, she had explained carefully, were not instantaneous in their effect. They required service of notice. They required the other party to receive them. She had sent the notice to the house. Caleb would have received it, which meant he knew. He knew there was a legal challenge. He knew I had a lawyer, and apparently, rather than pausing, he was accelerating. My hands were steady when I picked up my notebook. My handwriting was steady when I wrote down the date and the time and what I had heard. But the steadiness cost me something. I could feel it. Costing me something. The way you feel a muscle working when you've been holding a heavy thing for a long time. The next morning, I went to see Margaret. I did not take my usual walk route. I went directly, without detours, moving quickly enough that my breath fogged in the cold morning air. When I reached her office, she was already at her desk, and when she saw my face, she did not offer pleasantries. "They're planning to sell," I said. I heard them discussing the price. "Sit down," she said. She pulled a folder from the organized stacks on her desk and opened it. "I know. The injunction was received. I got confirmation of service yesterday afternoon." She looked up at me. "Evelyn, they ignored it." The word sat between us. "Ignored it," I repeated. "They've listed the property. As of this morning, it's on the market." She held my gaze steadily, the way she always did, without softening or looking away. "This changes our timeline considerably." I felt the floor do something it had no right to do, shift, briefly beneath me. Then I felt it settle. I put both hands flat on the arms of the chair and I said, "What do we do?" What we did was move, faster than anything in this process had moved before. Margaret filed an emergency motion with the county court to halt the listing and any potential sale pending resolution of the property dispute. She contacted the real estate agency that Caleb had listed with a firm called Halston Meridian, apparently one he had some connection to through his former business dealings, and served them with formal notice of the pending litigation, which under professional regulations required them to pause the listing or risk their own liability. She requested an emergency hearing date, citing the fraudulent transfer documentation, the involvement of Dennis Graydon, who she had by now confirmed had lost his notary commission in the state 4 years ago after multiple fraud complaints, and the evidence of coercive financial control I had been documenting since February. And she told me that the hearing, if she could get it scheduled within the week, would require me to appear, not in her office, in a courtroom. "You'll need to testify," she said. "Your account of events, the documents, the timeline you've been keeping." She paused. "I won't pretend this is comfortable. Caleb will be there. His attorney will be there. They will try to characterize you as confused, as having willingly agreed to these arrangements, as someone who doesn't understand what she signed because of, she chose her words carefully, age-related cognitive decline." The phrase landed like a stone. "They'll say I'm senile," I said flatly. "They'll imply it. They won't say it outright because they can't prove it. But yes, that will be the subtext of their defense." I thought about this. I thought about sitting in a courtroom while Caleb's lawyer painted me as a confused old woman who had given her house to her son and then changed her mind about it. I thought about what that would feel like. I decided it would feel exactly as bad as it sounded, and that I was going to do it anyway. "Schedule the hearing," I said. The hearing was set for a Thursday, 9 days away. Those 9 days were the longest of the entire ordeal, longer even than the first nights in the basement, which at least had the particular numbness of shock to cushion them. These 9 days had no cushion. I was awake. I was aware. And I had to continue living in that house, moving through the days, making myself invisible and unremarkable, while Caleb and Vanessa moved above me in the version of my life they had stolen, not knowing that in 9 days everything was going to change. Or rather not knowing for certain, because something had shifted in the house in the days after the injunction was served. I could feel it the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure, not visible but present, a tightening in the air. Caleb became quieter. His social laugh disappeared from the evenings. Vanessa started going through papers in the study. I could hear the drawers opening and closing, the sound of pages, the particular concentrated silence of someone looking for something or checking on something they'd already put somewhere. On the 5th day before the hearing, Caleb came down to the basement. He knocked first, which he almost never did. He usually just opened the door and called down, as though the space were still a storage room, and my presence in it merely incidental. The knock itself told me something was wrong, or that he thought something was wrong, or that he was beginning, finally, to understand that I was not what he had decided I was. I was sitting at my makeshift work table, a wooden door laid across two sawhorses that had been down here, since Robert used them for a project in the early 2000s with my documents arranged in front of me. I had 1 second to decide what to do with them. I did not hide them. I left them exactly where they were, and I turned to face the stairs. He came down slowly, which was also unusual. Caleb was a person who moved through spaces with confidence, who took stairs quickly, who occupied rooms like he expected them to accommodate him rather than the reverse. He came down these stairs, like someone who wasn't sure what he was walking into. He stopped when he saw the work table, the documents, the notebooks. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, and he looked at everything laid out before him. And his face did something complicated, something that moved through several expressions too quickly for me to name all of them. Though I caught confusion and something I might have called fear before he shut it all down and arranged his face back into the careful neutrality he'd been using with me for months. "What is all this?" he said. "My records," I said. "You've been," he stopped. Started again. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something." "All right," I said. I did not get up. I did not move toward him. I sat at my work table with my hands in my lap, and I waited. He came further into the basement, which meant he had to walk past the shelves of filing boxes, past the 32 years of documentation that I had been mining for the past 2 months. He pulled a folding chair from against the wall, a chair that had been down here since Caleb's childhood, the same one he used to sit in while Robert worked on things with tools, and Caleb handed him parts and asked questions, and he sat down across from me. He was wearing a gray t-shirt and dark jeans, and he looked, for the first time in a long time, like something other than the composed, managing version of himself he'd been performing. He looked tired. He looked like my son. It cost me something to notice that. It cost me something to still be able to look at him and see the person who had handed Robert the socket wrench and asked questions, the person who had cried when the dog died. But I did not let it cost me enough to matter. "We received some legal paperwork," he said. He was watching me carefully. "From an attorney named Okafor." "I know," I said. "You hired a lawyer." "Yes." The silence between us lasted about 4 seconds, which is a long time when you're measuring it. "Mom," his voice changed, dropped lower, softer, the register he used when he wanted to be taken as sincere. "I don't understand why you didn't just come to me. If you had questions about the documents, about the arrangements we made." "Caleb," I said quietly. "Stop." He stopped. "I don't have questions about the documents," I said. "I know what the documents say. I know what I signed, and I know what you told me I was signing, and I know that those two things are not the same." I kept my voice even. This was important. I had practiced it. Actually, in the quiet of the basement at night, keeping the emotion out of my voice, not because I didn't feel it, but because I refused to give him the opening of dismissing me as hysterical or confused. "I know about Dennis Graydon. I know he's not a financial advisor. I know his notary commission was revoked. I know about the property transfer. I know about the $11,000. The color left his face. Not gradually. All at once, the way color drains from something when the thing supporting it gives way. He sat across from me in the folding chair from his childhood, and he went pale, and for one long moment he looked exactly the way he had looked at 15, when I had caught him in a lie about where he had been on a Friday night that same look of. Realizing that the story he had constructed had gaps he hadn't accounted for, that the person he thought he was managing was in fact 3 steps ahead of him. "Mom, I can explain, I'm sure you believe that," I said. "But I'm not interested in your explanation right now. I'm interested in being in a courtroom on Thursday." He stood up abruptly. The folding chair scraped back on the concrete floor. "You're making a mistake. If this goes to court, it gets ugly. For everyone. Things come out, things get it. Doesn't have to be this way." "You're right," I said. "It didn't have to be this way. You made the choices that made it this way." He looked at me for a long moment. Standing there in the basement of the house I had paid for, in the space he had put me in, looking at his mother, across a wooden door, on sawhorses covered in the evidence of everything he had done. And I looked back at him without flinching, without dropping my eyes, without the apologetic softness I had been performing for months as camouflage. "Who else have you talked to?" he said. His voice was different now. Harder. "My attorney," I said, "and other people. People who have seen things." He left without another word. I heard him go up the stairs, heard the door close behind him, heard him cross the floor above me, and then heard voices, his and Vanessa's, low and urgent. The same register I had heard through the cracked study door back in February, when this had all become undeniable. I turned back to my documents. I picked up my pen. My hands were not entirely steady anymore, and I allowed the shakiness, sat with it, breathed through it. I was not made of stone. I had just sat across from my son and told him I knew everything, and some part of me that was still his mother, that would always be his mother regardless of what he had done, was in pain in a way that the legal case and the documentation and the 14-page timeline could not touch. But the other part of me, the part that had been raised by a man who worked double shifts, the part that had raised a child alone after a funeral, the part that had eaten oatmeal for dinner 4 nights a week and told no one that part was steady as rock, kept writing. The next 3 days were the worst of the ordeal in a specific, concentrated way. Caleb and Vanessa stopped pretending. The thin veneer of reasonableness, the performance of concern, the careful measured voices, all of it dropped away. And what was underneath was something I found easier to deal with. Actually, because at least it was honest. Vanessa stopped speaking to me entirely. When our paths crossed in the kitchen, I was still permitted to use the kitchen. Technically, though I had taken to going up only when I was fairly certain they were out or occupied. She looked through me as though I were furniture. Caleb spoke to me exactly twice in those 3 days, and both times it was brief and cold, and contained the implicit message that I was causing a problem by refusing to stay solved. On the second day, I came upstairs to make tea and found Vanessa at the kitchen table with a man I didn't recognize, late 30s, sharp suit, the particular posture of someone in a professional capacity. He looked up when I came in and then looked quickly back down at the papers in front of him. Vanessa did not introduce him. I put the kettle on and waited for it to boil with my back to the table and listened to them speak in lowered voices about something I could not quite parse, but which involved numbers and timelines and the word expedited several times. I took my tea back downstairs. I added unknown man. Sharp suit, Vanessa's kitchen meeting, discussed numbers and expedited timeline to my notebook with the date and time. On the third day before the hearing, something happened that I had not anticipated, and that changed the emotional texture of the remaining days in a way I am still not sure how to fully describe. My phone rang. Not the cell phone Caleb had given me. I had stopped using that one except for superficial things, aware of the possibility that he could track it. I had, on my third visit to Margaret's office, arranged a second phone, a basic prepaid handset that I kept at the bottom of my laundry bag, and only Margaret and Dolores had that number. It was that phone that rang, from the bottom of the laundry bag, at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning. It was not Margaret. It was a voice I had not heard in 4 years. Aunt Evelyn? My niece. Renata Solis, the daughter of my younger sister Claire, who had passed 6 years ago from an illness that had taken her faster than any of us had been prepared for. Renata was 34, lived in another state, and we had drifted in the way that family members drift when the person who connected them is gone. We exchanged birthday texts, occasionally cards at the end of the year. I had thought about her often, but called her rarely, not wanting to impose my grief on a young woman who was carrying her own. Renata, I said. My voice broke slightly on the word, which I had not expected. Someone called me, she said. A woman named Dolores. She said she's your neighbor, and she's been worried about you, and she didn't know how else to reach anyone in your family. A pause. Aunt Evelyn. What's happening? I sat down on the edge of my cot. I pressed my free hand flat on my knee. And then I told her all of it, in less time than it had taken me to tell Margaret, because by now I had the shape of it down. I could trace its outline without getting lost in the individual details. I knew where it started and where it currently was and what was going to happen on Thursday. Renata was quiet through most of it. When I finished, she said, I'm coming. You don't have to, I'm coming Thursday, she said. I'll be there for the hearing. You're not going into that courtroom without someone in your corner who isn't a lawyer. I didn't argue. I was not a person who easily accepted help. This was one of my genuine flaws, the kind I could acknowledge without enjoying the acknowledgement. But I was tired enough, and the week ahead was formidable enough that I simply said thank you and meant it all the way through. Thursday came. I had laid out my clothes the night before my good Navy suit, the one I had worn to Robert's memorial service, and then to 2 college graduations, and then to nothing for the past 5 years, because I had not had occasion to wear it. I had pressed it carefully with the iron I kept in the basement. I had polished my shoes. These were not vanity considerations. They were strategic ones. I intended to walk into that courtroom looking exactly like what I was, a woman who owned property, who managed her affairs, who made decisions and understood their implications, and not 1 degree like the confused, declining elderly person Caleb's lawyer would try to portray. Renata arrived at 6 in the morning, having driven through the night. I heard the knock at the front door, and I went upstairs in my robe and opened it. And she was standing on my front porch with dark circles under her eyes and a travel bag over her shoulder, and the particular expression of someone who has been running on coffee and indignation for approximately 12 hours. She looked at me. Then she looked past me at the house. Then she looked at me again, and I could see her taking inventory of the changes, the displacement of things that should have been where they weren't, the general feeling of a space that had been colonized. "Oh, Aunt Evelyn," she said quietly. "Come in," I said. "I'll make coffee." Caleb appeared at the top of the stairs about 20 minutes later, drawn by the sounds of voices in the kitchen. He stopped on the landing when he saw Renata sitting at the kitchen table, both hands around a coffee mug, looking at him with the particular look of a younger person who has heard an accounting of your actions and found them severely wanting. "Renata," he said. His voice was controlled, but not well. "Caleb," she said. The silence lasted about 3 seconds. Then Caleb said, "This is a family matter." "Yes," Renata said. "It is. That's why I'm here." He went back upstairs. I heard him and Vanessa talking behind their closed door. My closed door, my bedroom, the room, with the morning light that Vanessa had wanted, and I did not try to make out the words. I sat at the kitchen table with my niece, and I drank my coffee, and I felt for the first time in as long as I could remember that I was not entirely alone in my own home. The hearing was at 10. Margaret met us outside the courthouse at 9:15, reviewed the plan with me briefly, checked that I had the documents I needed, originals where possible, certified copies where originals were not practical, and then we went inside. The room was smaller than I had pictured. Courtrooms in films are always large and dramatic, with vaulted ceilings and rows of observers, and a weight of ceremony that fills the space. This was a civil court hearing room, not a criminal trial. It was functional and fluorescent lit, and smelled like old paper and carpet cleaner. There were 2 long tables facing the judge's bench. We sat at one. Caleb and his attorney sat at the other. I had not seen Caleb in a suit in years. He had put on the charcoal one he wore to his cousin's wedding in 2019, and he was sitting up very straight, and he would not look at me. Vanessa was not there. Margaret had told me she would likely not attend, that it would serve their case better to keep her at a remove. That absence was its own information, I thought. The judge was a woman in her early 60s named the Honorable Patricia Crane, with reading glasses and an economy of expression that I found immediately reassuring. She was not there to perform. She was there to work. What followed was 3 hours that I am going to tell you about in detail, because the detail matters. Because what happened in that room was not a neat or simple vindication. It was messy, and at moments excruciating, and there was a period in the middle of the second hour where I genuinely was not certain how it was going to go. Caleb's attorney was a man named Vincent Pryor, early 50s, silver hair, the kind of physical confidence that comes from years of winning arguments in rooms like this one. He was good. I want to say that honestly. He was strategic and he was composed, and he built his argument carefully, starting from the premise that Evelyn Harper was a woman who had, over a period of several months, voluntarily and with full awareness entered into a series of estate planning arrangements with her son, arrangements that were entirely legal and appropriate, and which she was now challenging not because they were fraudulent, but because the family relationship had deteriorated and she regretted decisions she had made freely. He did not say the word senile. He said things like Mrs. Harper may not have fully understood the long-term implications and given Mrs. Harper's situation at the time, her recollection of events may not be entirely reliable, and it's not uncommon for elderly individuals to revisit decisions when circumstances change. Every sentence was a scalpel, precise and deniable. I sat at the table, and I listened to every word, and I did not react visibly, because I had decided before I walked into this room that my composure was one of my most important pieces of evidence. Margaret was better. She was quieter
than Pryor,
which in this context worked in her favor. She had the particular authority of someone who does not need volume, because the substance of what she's presenting is sufficient. She laid out the financial records methodically. She presented the timeline I had built, which she had formatted into a clean legal exhibit. She introduced Dennis Graydon into the record, his background, his lost commission, his role in the document at Simpson. She presented Dolores Fitch's written statement, which described, in plain and specific language, the changes she had observed at my property over the past 6 months. And then there was the moment I had not known was coming, that Margaret had not told me about in advance, perhaps because she wanted my reaction to it to be genuine. She introduced the recording. I did not know that Dolores, on one of the evenings in late March, when Caleb and Vanessa had friends over, had been sitting in her backyard directly adjacent to mine, and had had her phone in her hand, and had not entirely accidentally, she would later tell me, recorded a portion of a conversation that had drifted over the fence. It was not long. It was not high-quality outdoor ambient sound, voices partially obscured, but it was audible enough, and it contained Caleb's voice saying 2 sentences clearly enough for anyone in the room to understand. She signed what she needed to sign. She doesn't know what any of it means. The room was very still after that recording played. I looked at my hands on the table in front of me. I kept them still. I did not look at Caleb. I did not need to. Judge Crane asked several questions pointed, specific questions about the timeline of the transfer, about Graydon's credentials, about the disparity between what the documents stated and what I had been told they stated. Pryor answered where he could and hedged where he couldn't, and once, just once, I saw him glance over at Caleb with an expression that was not quite irritation, but lived close to it the look of a lawyer, who has realized that his client did not give him the full picture. Then the judge asked me to speak directly. I had been waiting for this. I had been preparing for this, in the basement, in the quiet hours, in the careful language I had rehearsed not to sound rehearsed. I told the judge, in my own words, what had happened. Not the legal version Margaret had done that. The human version. The Sunday afternoon in my kitchen. The documents I had signed because my son was sitting across from me, and I believed, in that moment, that a son did not do this to a mother. The night I had heard the conversation through the cracked door. The basement. Not as a dramatic appeal, I was not interested in theater. As an account. Clear, specific, dated, and true. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Judge Crane looked at me over her reading glasses, and what I saw in her expression was not pity. It was attention, the focused, respectful attention of someone who has heard a great deal and knows the difference between a performance and a testimony. She ordered a temporary halt on all property transactions pending a full evidentiary hearing to be scheduled within 30 days. She ordered the immediate restoration of Evelyn Harper's access to and authority over her primary residence. And she referred the matter of Dennis Graydon and the fraudulent document preparation to the County District Attorney's Office for review. It was not over. I want to be clear about that this was not the end. The full hearing was still 30 days away. Caleb had not been handcuffed. The property had not been legally restored in full. There were still weeks of legal process ahead, more documents, more testimony, more of the grinding procedural work that actually constitutes justice in real life as opposed to the clean resolution of stories. But when we walked out of that courthouse into the thin April afternoon, Renata took my hand, and Margaret walked on my other side, and for the first time in 6 months, I walked out of a legal proceeding towards something, rather than away from it. My legs were shaking. I noticed that only after we reached the sidewalk, a fine, constant trembling in my knees that I had apparently been suppressing for the past 3 hours. I stopped walking. I put one hand on a parking meter and I breathed. "You were extraordinary in there," Renata said. "I was terrified," I said. "I know," she said. "That's why it was extraordinary." Across the parking lot, through the thin April light, I could see Caleb walking to his car with his attorney. He stopped once and looked back in my direction, just briefly, just for a moment, and even at that distance I could see that the composure was cracked now, that the careful management he had maintained through the hearing had cost him something he hadn't fully budgeted for. He looked like a man who had just understood, with a clarity that could not be walked back, that the situation he had believed was under control was not. He got in his car and drove away. I let go of the parking meter. My knees had steadied. We had 30 days until the full hearing. 30 days to build what Margaret called the complete evidentiary case, to pull together everything I had been accumulating since February in the basement, to formalize the timeline, to work with the county financial records, to document the property transfer chain, to locate and formally depose Dennis Graydon. 30 days of work, the kind of work I knew how to do. I had spent 6 months in a basement with my filing system and my notebooks and the single pull chain light, and I had built something in that time, not just a legal case, but an understanding of exactly how much I was capable of when someone had finally pushed me far enough that I had nothing left to be cautious about. I was not done. I was in every sense that mattered just beginning. The 30 days between the preliminary hearing and the full evidentiary proceeding were not what I expected them to be. I had anticipated a kind of forward momentum, the clean, purposeful feeling of moving toward resolution, of building something that would hold. And there was some of that. Margaret and I met 3 times in the first 2 weeks, working through the documentation with a precision that I found genuinely satisfying. The way organizing anything you've been living inside of chaotically finally gives it a shape you can hold in both hands. We formalized the timeline. We cataloged the financial records. We prepared my testimony in the specific way that courtroom testimony differs from ordinary speech, not scripted, but structured. Organized so that the most verifiable facts came first, and the emotional weight of the experience was carried by the facts themselves rather than by how I described feeling about them. Margaret was careful to explain this distinction to me. Judges in civil proceedings respond to evidence, she said. During our second meeting, sliding a neatly bound folder across the desk to me, they respond to documents and testimony and patterns that can be demonstrated. The story you have is compelling, but what makes it legally powerful is that every part of it is provable. Don't let the emotion lead. Let the evidence lead, and the emotion will follow on its own. I understood what she meant. I also understood that she was gently preparing me for the possibility that the emotion would surface in ways I couldn't entirely control, and that this was not a weakness but a human reality to be managed rather than suppressed. What I had not anticipated was Caleb's countermove. It came on the 11th day after the preliminary hearing, delivered not in person, but through Pryor's office, a formal letter addressed to Margaret outlining what Caleb and Vanessa were now proposing as a settlement. The letter was 14 pages long. I read all 14 pages sitting at Margaret's desk while she watched me from across it with the careful neutrality she used when she wanted me to form my own reaction before she offered hers. The settlement proposal was, in the language it used, extraordinarily reasonable. Caleb was willing to acknowledge that certain aspects of the property transfer arrangement had been communicated imperfectly, not fraudulent, not deliberately deceptive, but imperfect. He was willing to restore primary residence rights to me. He was willing to repay a portion of the funds that had been withdrawn from my account, not the full amount, and framed not as repayment of stolen money, but as a gift to address any financial concerns. He proposed that I retain lifetime residency in the house, while the legal ownership transferred into a jointly held family trust with him as co-trustee. Co-trustee. My son, who had put me in a basement, as co-trustee of the property I had paid for across 31 years. I set the letter down. No, I said. Margaret nodded once, slowly, as though she had expected this answer but needed to hear it said clearly before we proceeded. There are people who would advise you to take it, she said. The full evidentiary hearing is not without risk. Pryor is competent. The recording from Dolores is our strongest piece, but recordings from a neighbor's backyard have been successfully challenged before on foundation and clarity. I want you to know that. I know, I said. You told me. I want you to know it again, she said. Because you're about to decline a settlement that would give you your home back, partially, and I need you to be making that decision with clear eyes. I looked at her across the desk. Outside her window, the May afternoon was bright and warm, the kind of afternoon that feels like a promise. I had spent the morning in my house again, in the physical sense, since Caleb and Vanessa had moved to an apartment 3 days after the preliminary hearing, moving out quickly and without ceremony, taking what was theirs and leaving what was mine in various states of displacement throughout the rooms. And I had stood in the kitchen and the study and the living room and felt the specific grief of seeing familiar spaces made unfamiliar by the hands of people who had used them carelessly. They had left the kitchen in a state that took me 2 days to address. Vanessa had reorganized the pantry in a way that made no organizational sense to me. There were marks on the walls in the study where Caleb had hung things without asking. My garden, the rose bushes along the back fence, had not been touched since winter, and several of the rose canes had been damaged not deliberately. I thought, but through the particular carelessness of people who do not love a thing and therefore do not see it. Grief was the word for all of that, not just anger. Grief. But grief was not a reason to accept a settlement that would tie me permanently to a man I could no longer trust with anything, let alone the legal authority to make decisions about my property. Clear eyes, I said. That's exactly how I'm seeing it. We go to the full hearing. Margaret held my gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and said, "All right, let's talk about Graydon." Dennis Graydon had been located. He was living in a town about 40 miles away, and he had, since the county district attorney's office had initiated their review, retained his own attorney, a different attorney than prior, which Margaret noted was significant. It suggested that Graydon and Caleb were no longer coordinating their legal positions, which in turn suggested that Graydon was considering the possibility of cooperating with investigators in exchange for some degree of consideration regarding his own exposure. "He may offer a statement," Margaret said. "If he does, it corroborates the fraudulent transfer in a way that Pryor cannot easily explain away. Person who was present at the document signing, who acknowledges the misrepresentation involved that's powerful." "Do we know if he will?" I asked. "Not yet. His attorney has made preliminary contact with the DA's office. We'll know more within the week." I left Margaret's office that afternoon and drove home. I had taken to driving again, reclaiming the independence of it. After months of walking routes calibrated to avoid detection, and I pulled into my own driveway and sat in the car for a moment before going inside. The house looked the same as it always had from the outside. The same white siding, the same dark shutters, the same front porch, where Robert and I had spent summer evenings for 3 decades. Whatever had happened inside it, whatever had been done and undone, and was still in the process of being addressed, the outside had not changed. I went inside and I made dinner, and I ate it at my kitchen table, alone, in the kitchen that was mine again, and I did not allow myself to think too hard about what the full hearing might bring. The week passed. 3 things happened in it that changed the shape of what was coming. The first was Graydon. On a Wednesday morning, Margaret called me on the prepaid phone I had kept it, though the main reason for having it had passed with Caleb's departure, and told me that Dennis Graydon had agreed to provide a formal statement to the district attorney's office. In it, according to what the DA's office was willing to share with Margaret, Graydon confirmed that he had been hired by Caleb Harper to oversee the signing of property transfer documents, that he had been aware his notary commission was not valid, and that he had been specifically instructed by Caleb on how to present the documents to me in a way that would minimize my scrutiny of their content. He had been paid $3,000 for his participation. $3,000. That was what my son had paid someone to help him steal my house. I sat with that number for a while. I am not sure what I expected it to be more, maybe. Something that would feel proportionate to the scale of what had been done. $3,000 felt almost insulting in its smallness. The second thing was a phone call from Caleb. He called on a Thursday evening. He used his regular number, the one I still had saved in my phone contacts under his name, which I had not yet changed or deleted, because I had not decided what to do with it. I looked at the screen for 2 full rings before I answered. "Caleb," I said, "Mom." His voice was different from any version of it I had heard in recent months. Not the managing voice, not the social voice, not even the cold voice from the basement. This was something stripped back, something that didn't have a performance underneath it. It was just his voice, the one I had known for 41 years, and it was tired in a way that made my chest tighten without my permission. "What do you want?" I said. Not cruelly, but directly. "I want to." He stopped. Started again. I don't know why I called. "Caleb, I know what's going to happen," he said. "The hearing. I know what Graydon said. My attorney told me. And I know you're not going to take the settlement." A long pause. I want to say that I know. Another stop. Longer. I waited. "I convinced myself it wasn't what it was," he said finally. "That I was helping. That you didn't really need that the house was going to." He wasn't finishing his sentences, which was unlike him. He was a person who always finished his sentences, who never left a thought dangling. because he was too careful with how he presented himself to let incomplete things hang in the air. I know that's not a reason. I know it doesn't, I know. I sat at my kitchen table in the house he had tried to take from me, and I listened to my son not quite apologize, not quite explain, talk in circles around the edges of something he could not bring himself to say directly. And I felt, I want to be honest about this, I felt grief again. Same grief. Not softness toward what he had done, not a loosening of my position or my resolve. Just the grief of a mother who can hear her child in pain and knows that the pain is of their own making and cannot be fixed by her. Has never been able to be fixed by her. Was never supposed to be. You should talk to your attorney, I said finally. Not to me, I know, he said. I paused. I loved you as well as I knew how. I still do, in whatever way that's still possible. That doesn't change what you did, and it doesn't change what I'm going to do about it. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, I know that too. We stayed on the line for a few more seconds without speaking, which was its own kind of conversation, the kind you can only have with someone who has known you long enough that silence carries meaning. Then he said goodbye, and I said goodbye, and the call ended, and I sat at the table in the quiet kitchen, and I pressed my hands flat on the tabletop and breathed. Cried a little. I want to include that because I think it matters, because if I had not cried at any point in this story, that would have been its own kind of dishonesty. Cried for about 10 minutes. The tight, controlled kind of crying that is more about pressure release than grief. And then I washed my face and went to bed and slept better than I had in months. The third thing was Vanessa. I had not expected to encounter her at all before the hearing. She had moved out with Caleb. She was not appearing in any of the legal proceedings directly, and I had assumed she was maintaining a strategic distance from anything that could increase her own legal exposure. I had not thought about her much. To be honest, she had been instrumental in what happened. She had participated actively, but in my internal accounting of the betrayal, she occupied a different position than Caleb. She had not been my child. She had not been my responsibility or my love in the same structural way. What she had done was cruel and deliberate, but it did not carry the same specific weight. I ran into her at a grocery store on a Friday afternoon, 10 days before the hearing. She was in the produce section, holding a bunch of carrots, and she looked up and saw me at the same moment I saw her, and neither of us moved for a long second. She had lost weight since the hearing. Her face was sharper, more drawn, with a tightness around her eyes that I recognized as a kind of sustained stress. She was not the composed, carefully presented woman who had stood in my kitchen doorframe and informed me that my bedroom was being repurposed. She was a woman who had been living with the consequences of a plan that had not gone the way she expected. Pushed my cart forward. I was not going to make a scene in a grocery store. I was not going to give her anything, not anger, not acknowledgement, not the satisfaction of knowing I thought about her, enough to be affected by the accidental encounter. She spoke first. Evelyn, I stopped. I looked at her. I need you to know, she said, that some of this was not that I didn't think it would go this far. I looked at her for a moment. I considered the words. Didn't think it would go this far. Not I was wrong. Not I should not have done it. Not even I'm sorry. Just a soft repositioning of herself, just slightly outside the perimeter of responsibility, the particular maneuver of a person who wants credit for a conscience without fully claiming one. Vanessa, I said, you stood in the doorway of my bedroom and told me it was being repurposed as an office. You handed me documents and pointed to the signature lines while your husband watched. You told my neighbor of 16 years that I was not available. I kept my voice level. I kept the cart between us. I'm not interested in what you thought or how far you thought things would go. I'm interested in the full hearing on the 23rd. I suggest you speak to your attorney about what's in the statement Dennis Graydon gave to the district attorney's office. Her face changed. The drawn tightness shifted into something that was closer to genuine alarm. She hadn't known about Graydon's statement, or she hadn't known the extent of it. Pushed my cart forward, and I finished my shopping and I drove home. The day before the full hearing, Renata came back. She had gone home after the preliminary hearing. She had a job, a life, obligations she had already disrupted to be there for me the first time. But she had called every few days to check in, and when I told her the full hearing was scheduled, she had said immediately that she was coming again. She arrived the evening before, this time having flown rather than driven, and she came directly from the airport to my house, and we sat at the kitchen table and ate the dinner I had made and talked about things that had nothing to do with the hearing, about Claire, her mother, about a trip Renata was planning later in the year, about the rose bushes coming in, finally along the back fence. Normal things, human things. The kind of conversation that reminds you that life is not only the crisis you're currently inside of. Are you ready for tomorrow? She asked eventually. I've been ready since February, I said. I've just been waiting for tomorrow to catch up. Smiled at that. She looked like Claire when she smiled around the eyes especially. Something in the particular shape of the expression that was entirely her mother's, and I felt the familiar ache of missing someone who was gone and the different, less familiar feeling of being grateful for what remained. We went to bed at a reasonable hour. I slept. Not perfectly, I woke at 4 and lay in the dark for an hour before sleep came back, but I slept. The morning of the hearing was clear and warm, the kind of May morning that arrives already fully made, with no ambiguity in it. I dressed in my navy suit again. I pressed it again the night before. Renata was up before me, which I had not expected, and there was coffee already made when I came downstairs, and she was sitting at the kitchen table in clean clothes with her hair done and her expression composed in a way that told me she had also been awake at 4. You look like your mother, I told her. I know, she said. She'd have been here if she could. We drove to the courthouse. The evidentiary hearing was a different atmosphere from the preliminary one, fuller, more formal, with more people in the room, and a greater sense of the machinery of legal process in motion. Pryor was there with Caleb, who sat at the opposing table in a different suit this time, a dark blue one, and who looked as though the past month had done to him. What sustained pressure does to any structure compressed it, made it smaller and denser and less readable from the outside. He glanced at me once when we came in and then looked directly ahead and did not look at me again. Margaret presented the case with the methodical precision I had come to recognize as her particular professional gift. She did not overdramatize. She let the documents do the work. The original deed, the mortgage payment history, the financial records showing the pattern of withdrawals. Timeline I had built, now formally entered as an exhibit. The recording from Dolores's backyard, which had been cleaned up by a forensic audio specialist, enough to render Caleb's 2 sentences unmistakably clear. Dennis Grayson's formal statement, which confirmed the fraudulent nature of the document preparation, and Caleb's specific instructions. And then Pryor presented his case. I will say this for Vincent Pryor, he was a professional in the truest sense, which meant he continued to do his job with full commitment, even when the materials he was working with were insufficient. He argued procedural points. He argued that the recording's chain of custody was imperfect. He suggested that Graydon's statement was the self-interested account of someone trying to reduce his own liability. He returned several times to the characterization of me as a woman who had entered these arrangements willingly and was now revising her memory of events in light of changed family circumstances. He was not able to argue the financial records. There was no version of the withdrawal pattern that could be characterized as voluntary or consensual or consistent with careful estate planning. $11,000, moved in small increments over 4 months through a banking portal that had been accessed under my login credentials without my knowledge that was not ambiguous. Margaret had obtained the access logs from the bank, which showed the login times and the IP addresses, and none of them were mine. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Judge Crane asked questions throughout sharp, specific questions that moved between the legal and the practical, with the fluency of someone who had done this for many years and knew exactly where the load-bearing points of each argument were. She asked Caleb directly at one point to explain the nature of his arrangement with Dennis Graydon. Pryor objected, and the objection was overruled, and Caleb sat there for a long moment before answering in careful, minimized language that satisfied no one in the room. When the testimony and arguments were complete, Judge Crane did not retire to deliberate. She reviewed her notes for several minutes in a silence that the room somehow maintained without apparent effort, and then she spoke. The fraudulent property transfer was voided. The deed was to be restored to Evelyn Margaret Harper as sole owner within 14 business days, with all associated county records corrected accordingly. The matter of the financial withdrawals, $11,460, was ordered to be repaid in full within 60 days, classified not as a gift or family transfer, but as restitution for funds removed without authorization. The criminal referral to the district attorney's office regarding Dennis Graydon and the broader circumstances of the document preparation was confirmed and active. She also said something that was not legally binding, but that I have thought about many times since. She said, looking not at the lawyers but at the room in general, at the people in it, in the tone of a person who has seen this particular situation in too many variations to pretend it is unusual. Financial exploitation of elderly family members is not a gray area. It is not a family dispute. It is not a misunderstanding. It is a serious harm, and the courts have both the authority and the obligation to address it as such. The room was quiet after she said it. I sat at the plaintiff's table, and I put my hands flat on the surface in front of me, and I breathed. It was not the relief I had anticipated. I want to be honest about that too. I had thought somewhere in the back of the months of preparation, in the quiet of the basement at night, that when this moment came, it would feel like something large and clean, like a window opening, like the specific physical sensation of putting down something very heavy. And there was some of that. There was genuine relief. But it was threaded through with all the other things that don't go away, simply because the legal question has been resolved. The grief, the exhaustion, the strange disorientation of having fought for so long toward a single point and then arriving at it, and finding that the world had not reorganized itself around the victory. My house was mine again, on paper, immediately. In the physical reality of walking back through the door and claiming the space that had been mine for 31 years, that would take longer. Not because of any legal obstacle, because of the internal work that legal victories cannot do for you. Outside the courthouse, Renata hugged me for a long time. Margaret shook my hand with both of hers and said she would be in touch about the paperwork timeline. And then she left. She had another client, another case, the endless forward motion of a person whose work is other people's worst days. And Renata and I stood on the courthouse steps the May afternoon and said nothing for a while. Across the parking lot, I saw Caleb walk to his car with Pryor beside him. They were speaking, and from the body language, I could see that it was not a comfortable conversation. Pryor, with the slightly forward lean of a person delivering unwelcome information. Caleb, with the stillness of someone receiving it. After a moment, Pryor got into his own car and drove away, and Caleb stood beside his for a moment, alone in the parking lot. He didn't look in my direction. I didn't call to him or wave or make any gesture that would require him to decide how to respond. I simply watched him the way you watch a thing that has been part of your life for a very long time and is now somehow transformed into something you no longer entirely recognize. He got in his car. He drove away. "Come on," Renata said. She took my arm gently. "Let's go home." We drove back to the house. We parked in the driveway. We went inside, and I stood in the entrance hall of the home I had paid for and built a life inside of, and been pushed to the bottom of, and fought my way back through. And I looked at the walls and the floors and the light coming through the windows, and I felt not triumph, not the clean, bright thing triumph is supposed to be. Something quieter, something that was going to take a long time to fully understand. Renata went to the kitchen to put the kettle on. I walked through the living room and into the study and stood at the window that looked out over the backyard. The rose bushes were in full bloom now, later than usual, the cold spring having held them back, but here at last, the same deep red they had been every year since Robert planted them, surviving, coming back, making no particular announcement about it. I stood there looking at them for a long time. The work ahead of me was not small. The legal victory was real, and it mattered. But what it had returned to me was a house that needed reclaiming in ways that went beyond paperwork. The rooms needed to feel like mine again. The spaces needed to breathe differently than they had breathed for the past 6 months. The study needed to stop carrying the residue of Caleb's late-night phone calls and Vanessa's organized differently drawers. The kitchen needed to feel like the kitchen where I had cooked and eaten and lived for 3 decades, rather than the kitchen where I had retreated to make tea and carry it back downstairs. And I needed to decide what I was going to do about the basement. I had thought about this. I had thought about it specifically, turning the question over during the long evenings since Caleb and Vanessa had moved out, sitting in the rooms upstairs and still somehow gravitating toward the basement in my thoughts. The basement where I had slept on a cot, where I had built my case. where I had pressed my hand against the ceiling and listened to the footsteps above me, where I had found, in the middle of the worst period of my adult life, a version of myself I had not known was still in me, patient, methodical, unbreakable in the specific way that things become unbreakable when they have already been broken and have reconstituted themselves around the break. I was not going to let it just be a storage room again. That felt wrong. That felt like covering something over rather than reckoning with it. The basement had been the place where they had put me to get me out of the way, and instead it had become the place where I had prepared everything that had led to this afternoon. This courthouse, this window, these roses. It deserved better than to just go back to being where the holiday decorations lived. I did not yet know what I was going to make of it. That was still in the future, the deciding, the doing, the slow work of transforming a space from what it had been into what it should be next. But I knew I was going to do something with it, something deliberate, something that acknowledged what had happened there without being defined entirely by it. Renata called from the kitchen that the tea was ready. I turned from the window. I walked through the study and the living room and into the kitchen, where my niece was standing at my counter, pouring hot water into my teapot, the same teapot I had owned for 20 years, painted blue with a small chip in the lid that I had never gotten around to replacing. I sat at my kitchen table. Outside, the May afternoon light was doing what May afternoon light does when it's at its best, making everything it touched look a little more worth having than it had seemed a moment before. I was not finished with the grief. I was not finished with the anger, which came and went in waves that I was learning to ride, rather than resist. I was not finished with the complicated, unresolvable love that persisted beneath both of those things like water under rock, the love that had not saved me from being hurt and had not saved my son from becoming someone capable of hurting me, and that was going to require an entirely separate reckoning that no court could schedule or adjudicate. But I was in my kitchen, my table, my teapot with the chipped lid, and outside the window, visible just at the edge of where the backyard started, the first red roses of the season had opened against the fence. They had come back. They always came back. The deed arrived on a Tuesday morning, 14 business days after the hearing, exactly as Judge Crane had ordered. Came in a manila envelope from the county recorder's office, and I almost missed it because I had been in the backyard when the mail carrier came, kneeling in the dirt beside the rose bushes with a pair of pruning shears, cutting back the dead canes that the winter had left behind and that I had not had the freedom or the heart to address until now. I heard the mail slot and went inside and found the envelope on the floor of the entrance hall. And I stood there in my gardening clothes with dirt on my knees, and I opened it. Evelyn Margaret Harper, sole owner. I read my name twice, not because I couldn't read it the first time, but because I wanted to feel it twice. The specific weight of seeing your own name on a document that confirms you are still who you always were, that no one, regardless of how carefully they planned, or how many papers they put in front of you, or how completely they tried to rewrite the story of your life, that no one had managed to erase you. I sat down on the floor of my entrance hall, not because my legs gave out, because I chose to. I sat down on the hardwood floor in my gardening clothes, and I held the deed in both hands, and I let myself feel everything I had been managing carefully for 8 months, the fear, the grief, the specific corrosive loneliness of being reduced in your own home by your own child, the exhaustion of fighting a war that no one was supposed to know you were fighting. I let all of it come at once, and it came hard, and I sat there on the floor, and I let it. Cried for a while. A real cry, the kind that is not about pressure release or tactical emotion management. The kind that comes from somewhere deep and cellular, from the part of you that has been holding itself together through an act of sustained will and finally feels that it is permitted to stop holding. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough that the morning light coming through the front windows shifted from the pale early kind to the warmer, more committed light of mid-morning. Long enough that the tears dried on their own, and I was just sitting there, breathing, with the deed in my hands and the dirt from the garden still on my knees. Then I got up. I went to the kitchen. I made coffee. I put the deed on the kitchen table in front of me, and I drank my coffee, and I looked at it, and slowly, over the course of that cup of coffee, something that had been wound extremely tight inside me for 8 months began, carefully, to loosen. The work of reclaiming the house had already started by then. I want to tell you about that work, because I think it is the part of this story that people don't hear enough, the part that comes after the legal victory, the part that is not dramatic in any courtroom sense, but that is, in its own way, the most significant part of all. In the 3 weeks since Caleb and Vanessa had moved out, and I had been restored to full use of my house, I had been methodically moving through each room. Not renovating, I couldn't afford renovation, and more importantly, I didn't want to cover over what had happened with fresh paint and new furniture the way you might cover a stain. I wanted to understand each room again, to relearn it, to be in it long enough and quietly enough that it started feeling like mine again, rather than like something that had been returned to me secondhand. The kitchen had been the easiest, strangely. Vanessa's reorganization of the pantry and the drawers had annoyed me in the abstract for months, but when I actually stood in front of the open cabinets and put things back where they belonged, my spices alphabetical by type, the way I had always kept them, the scissors and the tape and the birthday candles, back in the second drawer on the left, my good dishes in the cabinet above the stove, where they caught the morning light through the window, there was something almost meditative about it, returning each thing to its place, reasserting the order of my own daily life, item by item. The study had been harder. Caleb had been in there every night for months, and the room had absorbed that in ways that were difficult to articulate, something in the air, in the arrangement of the space, some residue of his presence and the things he had done in there that I could feel even when I was alone. I had taken everything out of it, every piece of furniture, every item from the shelves, even the curtains. I had cleaned the room from ceiling to floor. I had repainted the walls myself a pale gray blue that was nothing like the off-white they had been before, a deliberate change, a declaration that this room was beginning something rather than resuming something interrupted. I had put my desk back in its original position by the window. I had brought my filing boxes up from the basement, not all of them, just the current ones, and arranged the shelves the way I had always arranged them. On the first evening, I sat at my desk in the repainted study and paid my electric bill and filed the receipt in the appropriate folder. I felt something so ordinary and so complete that I had to sit there for a moment afterward without moving, just holding the feeling of it. This was mine, this ordinary, unremarkable evening task in this ordinary room. It was mine, and I had taken it back. The bedroom had been a process that stretched over 2 weeks and involved a degree of difficulty I had not fully anticipated. I had changed the bedding immediately, that was the easy part. But sleeping in that room again, in the room they had taken and used and converted, and then vacated, was its own kind of negotiation. The first night I woke at 2 a.m. and lay in the dark listening, for the sounds I had become accustomed to. Caleb's footsteps above me, the muffled conversation through the basement ceiling, and when I didn't hear them, I felt disoriented, as though the absence itself were wrong. As though I had spent so long in that basement, listening up, that the upstairs silence didn't compute. I lay there in my own bedroom in the dark, and I thought about that, about how completely a person can adapt to a diminished reality. How you can spend enough time in a space that isn't yours, that when your real space is returned to you, it feels briefly unfamiliar. How the damage of sustained mistreatment is not only in the mistreatment itself, but in what it does to your sense of what is normal, what you deserve, what you are permitted to take up. I was going to have to unlearn things. That was what I understood at 2 a.m. in my bedroom. The legal process had given me back the house. The emotional process of giving myself back was going to take longer and was not going to follow a court-ordered timeline. I fell asleep eventually, and the next night I slept a little better. And the night after that, better still. The basement was the last thing I addressed. I had been leaving it deliberately, knowing it deserved its own reckoning, knowing I needed to be ready for it in a way that couldn't be rushed. Cot was still there. The sawhorses and the wooden door I had used as a work table. The pull chain light. The filing boxes, most of them. The ones I hadn't brought upstairs. Everything exactly as it had been when I had been living and working in it. On a Saturday morning in early June, 3 weeks after the deed arrived, I went down there. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, and I looked at the space. I looked at the cot and the work table and the light bulb and the concrete floor and the small rectangular window through which I had watched the rose bushes bud in April with a desperation for ordinary beauty that I could still feel echoed in my chest when I thought about it. This room had been my humiliation. That was the truth I had to start with. the foundation of anything I was going to do with it. That it had been the space where my son had decided I belonged, where he had put me to contain me, to get me out of the way of his plans, where I had slept on a cot at 67 years old in my own house. And it had also been the room where I had built everything, where I had organized 30 years of documentation into a case that a judge found compelling enough to void a fraudulent property transfer, where I had made phone calls from a prepaid handset hidden in a laundry bag, where I had written 14 pages of notes in careful school teacher handwriting that had been entered as a formal legal exhibit, where I had sat in the dark at 2 in the morning and felt myself harden into something I hadn't known I still contained. Both things were true. Both things were the room. I spent the rest of that Saturday cleaning it, not converting it into something decorative or purposeful, in a new way not yet, maybe not ever, just cleaning it. Thoroughly, the way you clean something you're going to keep. I moved the cot to the side and swept the floor and washed the concrete with soap and warm water. I organized the filing boxes on their shelves with fresh labels. I replaced the bare bulb with a proper light fixture, a real one, with a shade that cast warm light instead of the harsh naked glare of the pull chain bulb. I kept the work table. The sawhorses had been Robert's, and the wooden door had been in this basement since the previous decade, and there was something in the solid practicality of it that felt worth keeping. I kept one corner exactly as it had been during the months I lived there. The cot, folded now, leaning against the wall. My old notebook on a small shelf beside it, the notebook where I had written all 14 pages of the timeline, plus a great deal more that had never made it into the legal proceedings. Things I had written, simply because I needed to write them. Because writing was how I had always processed what I couldn't say out loud. Kept these things not as a shrine to suffering, and not as a trophy, but as a record. As an acknowledgement that this had happened, and that it had happened here, and that I had survived it here, and that both of those facts deserved a physical space in the house that had been the site of all of it. I went upstairs when it was done. I made a sandwich and ate it at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the backyard and felt the particular satisfaction of having done a hard thing cleanly. The following week, Dennis Graydon was formally charged by the district attorney's office with notary fraud and participating in a scheme to defraud. His cooperation had earned him a reduced charge compared to what it might have been, but reduced did not mean absent, and the public record of his actions was now a permanent feature of his professional history, such as it was. Margaret called me to let me know when the charges were filed, and I thanked her and sat with the information for a while before deciding how I felt about it. What I mostly felt was that it was appropriate, not satisfying in any dramatic sense, just appropriate. A thing that had been wrong had been formally acknowledged as wrong. That was not nothing. Caleb's situation was more complicated, as I had known it would be. The fraudulent transfer had been voided. The restitution order for the $11,000 was in effect, and the first payment had arrived through Margaret's office, not in full. Installments, which meant this was not over in the financial sense, and would not be for some months yet. The criminal exposure from the DA's review of the broader circumstances remained active and unresolved, which meant Caleb was living, as far as I understood it, with a particular kind of suspended uncertainty, not charged, not cleared, waiting for a decision that had not yet been made. I did not take pleasure in that. I want to say that clearly. I did not sit in my recovered kitchen and feel satisfaction at the image of my son waiting for a criminal investigation to resolve. What I felt was something considerably more tangled, a knot of anger and grief, and the remnants of love and the exhaustion of having felt all of those things simultaneously for so long that they had stopped being distinct, and had become simply the weather I moved through. He called once more. In mid-June, about a month after the hearing. Same number. Same Thursday evening timing. As though the day of the week were a habit he couldn't break, I answered. The first payment went through, he said. To your attorney. I know, I said, she told me. Pause. I'm going to pay it all back. All of it. I know you will, I said. Because there's a court order requiring it. He didn't say anything to that. I heard him breathe. Caleb, I said, are you working with someone? A therapist? Or I paused. This was not a comfortable thing to ask. It was not a comfortable thing to care about. But I was asking because I genuinely meant it, not because I was performing the concerned mother for an audience. I was asking because, somewhere under all the layers of everything that had happened, I was still his mother, and I still believed that a person who could do what he had done to me was a person in significant pain of their own, pain that they had channeled in a direction that was destructive to both of us. "Are you talking to anyone?" He was quiet long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I started seeing someone last month." "Good," I said. "That's good." Another pause. "Mom, don't," I said, not harshly, but firmly not yet. "Whatever you want to say, it's too soon. When things are clearer, when more time has passed, maybe then."
"Okay," he said.
"Okay," I said. We said goodbye. I put the phone down on the kitchen table, and I sat there for a while in the evening light, and I thought about the word maybe. It was the most honest word I had offered him. Not yes, eventually. Not no, never. Maybe. The genuine uncertainty of not knowing what would be possible between us in a year or 2 years or 5 years, whether the relationship could be rebuilt into something functional and bounded and honest, or whether what had been done was simply too much and the distance would be permanent. I did not know. I was not going to pretend to know. Some things resolve cleanly and some things simply evolve, slowly, over time, into a shape you didn't plan for but can live with. This was going to be one of the latter. What I did know, what I had come to understand, with a clarity that the entire experience had burned into me, was that I was not going to spend another day of my life making myself smaller for someone else's comfort. Not for Caleb, not for anyone. The years I had spent being accommodating, being flexible, being the kind of person who said, "I'll think about it," when I should have said absolutely. Not those years were not recoverable, but the years ahead of me were mine in a way they had never quite felt before. Mine to shape. Mine to defend, mine to live in on my own terms without apologizing for the space I took up. I was 67 years old. I was not old. I refused the particular cultural habit of treating 67 as though it were a conclusion rather than a position in the middle of an ongoing story. My mother had lived to 89 and had been sharp and opinionated until the last year of her life. And her mother before her had lived to 91 and had started growing tomatoes from seed at the age of 83. I came from women who did not consider themselves finished. I was not finished. In July, I called Patricia Osei, the financial advisor who had helped me manage my retirement accounts before she moved her practice to another city. I had not spoken to her in almost 2 years. She answered on the second ring and said, "Evelyn Harper, I was wondering when you were going to call in the tone of someone who has heard things through channels and is not entirely surprised by the call." I told her what had happened, not all of it, but enough, and asked her if she would be willing to take me back on as a client and help me restructure things properly, with my name and only my name on every account, every authorization, every document. "Of course," she said. "I'll make time this week." I also called a locksmith. I had the locks changed, all of them. Every exterior door, not because I believed Caleb would come back in any physical sense, but because I had lived for 8 months in a house where I was not in control of who had keys to it, and I wanted the physical reality of the locks to match the legal reality of the deed. My house, my locks, my keys. Dolores came for tea in mid-July. We sat in the backyard on a warm afternoon, at the old iron table that had been there since Robert's time, and we talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with legal proceedings or court hearings or the months that had just passed. She told me about her garden and her grandchildren and a book she'd been reading. I told her about the study renovation and the new light fixture in the basement and the tomatoes I was trying to grow from seed in pots on the back porch. At one point she said, "I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner. When I first started noticing things, I kept telling myself it wasn't my business." "It wasn't," I said, "and then you made it your business when it mattered. That's what counts." She looked at me over her tea. "You're remarkably unbitter about all of this." "I'm somewhat bitter," I said honestly. "Just gotten better at where I put it." She laughed. It was a good laugh, the kind that fills a garden on a July afternoon and makes everything for a moment feel uncomplicated. Renata came back in August. Not for a crisis this time, for a visit, a planned one, the kind of visit that is just a visit. She stayed for 5 days, and we did things that people do when life is normal. We cooked dinners and walked through the neighborhood and went to a farmer's market on Saturday morning where I bought tomato starts, and she bought a jar of honey, and we ate lunch at a small restaurant on a street corner and talked about Claire, her mother, with the kind of ease that comes when grief has aged into something you can carry rather than something that is carrying you. On her last evening, We sat in the kitchen after dinner, with the windows open to the August air, and she said, "Tell me honestly, are you okay?" I thought about the question the way it deserved to be thought, about not the reflexive, yes. I'm fine that I had spent a lifetime giving to that question, the version that is really just a request to be left alone, but the actual honest assessment of a woman sitting in her own kitchen at 67 after everything the past year had contained. "I'm getting there," I said. "Some days better than others. Some mornings I wake up, and the first thing I feel is anger, and I have to consciously decide what to do with it. Some mornings I just feel I paused, looking for the right word, and finding it was simpler than I expected. Normal. Like myself. Like nothing happened, and also like something happened, and I came through it, and here I am." Renata nodded. She was good at listening. She had Claire's quality of actually hearing what was said rather than constructing her response while you were still talking. "That sounds right," she said. "That sounds like the truth." "It is," I said. "I'm not interested in pretending it's more resolved than it is. I'm also not interested in pretending it's worse than it is. It is what it is, and what it is complicated and survivable." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine for a moment. Just briefly. The way you touch someone when words are not the point. After she left, the house was quiet in the way it gets, when a presence departs full of the specific absence of someone who was just there. I had always found that feeling melancholy when I was younger, but I had come to understand it differently. The absence of a person you love in a house, evidence that the house has held love, is still holding it, that the walls carry something more than their own weight. I went downstairs to the basement. I had been going down there regularly not to work, not because anything required me to be there, but by choice. Something about it still drew me. I would go down in the evenings sometimes and sit in the chair I had set up in the cleaned, relit space and simply be there. Think. Occasionally write in one of the new notebooks I had started, after the legal process was over. Not documentation this time, not a timeline, just the ordinary flow of my thoughts and observations. The way I had kept journals in my 20s before the busyness of raising a child had crowded the habit out. I sat in the chair. The warm light from the new fixture made the space look entirely different from how it had looked. In the months I had lived there, less like a place you endure, and more like a room with a certain deliberate character. A room that had been looked at carefully and had things decided about it. The filing boxes were organized and labeled on their shelves. The cot and the notebook sat in their corner as I had arranged them. The work table was clear. I opened the new notebook. I wrote the date, and then I wrote the thing I had been circling around for weeks, the thing I kept approaching from different angles in my head without quite saying directly, even to myself. I wrote, "I built this case from a basement. I built it from 30 years of receipts and one prepaid phone and a neighbor I almost let slip away from me and a lawyer I found in a library on a public computer. I built it from the notebooks and the careful handwriting my third-grade teacher gave me and the financial discipline my father gave me and the stubbornness that I have always had and was always told was a flaw, and which turned out to be the thing that saved me. They put me in this room to silence me. They thought the basement was where old women go to stop mattering. They were wrong about that. They were wrong about most things, but they were most comprehensively wrong about that. I am not a cautionary tale. I am not a victim story. I am a woman who got taken apart and put herself back together, and the version I put together is better than the one they dismantled, because the one I put together has no illusions in it. I stopped writing. I looked at what I had written. Then I looked around the room, the shelves, the labeled boxes, the new light, the old cot in its corner, the small window near the ceiling, through which I could see, just barely, the dark shapes of the rose bushes in the summer night. There is something I want to say to you, whoever you are, wherever you are watching this, whatever your own particular version of this kind of story looks like. Because this story is not just mine. That is the thing about this kind of betrayal. It arrives in 1,000 different shapes and sizes, in different families and different circumstances, wearing different faces. But it is always, at its core, the same thing. Someone who decides that your age or your trust or your love makes you a resource to be used rather than a person to be honored. And the lie they tell you, the lie that enables all the rest of it, is that you are past the point where fighting back is possible. That you are too old, too tired, too isolated, too dependent. that the situation is already resolved in their favor, and the only question is how gracefully you will accept it. I want to tell you that lie is a tool, is specifically designed to make you put down what you're carrying before you've had a chance to use it. Because the people who use that lie know that if you believe you're powerless, you won't look in the boxes. You won't walk to the library. You won't call the number on the piece of paper. You won't, in short, do any of the small, undramatic, practical things that are actually how comebacks happen in real life. Comebacks in real life do not look like the movies. They are not a single confrontational scene where the music swells and everyone in the room understands simultaneously that something has shifted. They are 14 pages of handwritten notes. They are a neighbor you almost let drift away. They are a prepaid phone in a laundry bag. They are 8 months of patience while the people above you celebrate a victory they have not yet actually secured. I'm not telling you this because I want to make myself sound heroic. I don't feel heroic. I feel like a woman who got pushed into a corner and discovered, eventually, that she had more in the corner with her than she initially realized. That is a less romantic framing, but it is the accurate one. And I have reached the age where I prefer accurate. What I want you to take from this, if you are in something like this, if you know someone who is in something like this, if you are an older person who has been made to feel that your judgment cannot be trusted, your assets cannot be protected, and your dignity is something that younger, more capable people should manage on your behalf, I want you to hear this clearly. You have the right to say no. You have the right to say, I need to read this before I sign it. You have the right to call an attorney. You have the right to not be managed, to not have your affairs administered by people who have a financial interest in the outcome, to live in your own home, in your own bedroom, with your own locks on the doors. These are not privileges. They are not things you earn by being sufficiently sharp, or sufficiently young, or sufficiently in possession of whatever qualities the people around you have decided you need to demonstrate in order to be trusted with your own life. They are rights, categorical and unconditional. And if someone is trying to take them from you, if someone is slowly, methodically, kindly, reasonably restructuring your life in ways that serve their interests rather than yours, you are not obligated to be grateful for their help. You are not obligated to assume they mean well. You are not obligated to sign anything you have not read, to give access you have not decided to give, to go quietly into whatever space they have decided is appropriate for you. You are obligated to yourself, to your own mind and your own history, and your own 31 years of mortgage payments, in whatever form those take for you. That is the lesson. I did not learn it gently, and I am still learning parts of it, and I suspect I will be learning it for whatever years I have left. But I know it now, in a way I did not know it before, know it in my bones, know it in the way that only comes from having been tested and found out that the test was survivable. September came. The rose bushes along the back fence finished their season, the blooms going heavy and then dropping, the way they always did by the time the real heat broke. I pruned them back carefully, the way Robert had taught me, leaving enough cane to protect the root structure through the winter. They would come back in May. They always did. I had started in September, attending a support group that met on Wednesday evenings at the community center on Maple Street. It was a group specifically for older adults who had experienced financial exploitation. Elder law advocates and attorneys had started it 3 years ago in response to what they described as a significant and growing problem, which in my experience of it was a significant understatement. There were 9 of us in the group when I joined. Women and men, ranging from late 60s to mid-80s, from a range of circumstances and family situations, with stories that were different in their specifics but recognizable in their shape. I had not expected the group to be what it was. I had imagined something therapeutic in a soft way, a place to process feelings, which I did not, if I'm being honest, particularly want to do in a room full of strangers. What I found instead was something more practical and more useful. People who had been through the legal process and out the other side. People who had made mistakes in their own responses and were willing to say so. People who had things to teach and things to learn, who were not defined entirely by what had been done to them, but were also not pretending it hadn't been done. I started going every week. I brought my organized approach to the meetings the way I brought it to everything: notes, questions, specific resources I had found and wanted to share. After the 3rd meeting, one of the group facilitators, A woman named Joyce Alvarez, who had been a social worker for 30 years, asked if I would be willing to talk more specifically about how I had handled the documentation process, how I had organized and preserved my records in a way that made them legally usable. I said yes. I put together what I thought of as a practical talk, not a speech, not anything that required more from people than they were already giving, by showing up just a clear, organized explanation of what I had done and how, and what I wished I had done sooner, and what anyone in any situation like mine should do immediately if they suspected something was wrong. The talk went for 45 minutes and ran over time because people had questions that were real and specific and urgent. At the end, Joyce asked if I would come back the following month and talk about the legal process, what to look for in an attorney, what questions to ask, how to understand what you're being told in the meetings and the hearings. I said yes to that too. I am not going to pretend this was a transformation into something grand. I was not reborn as a crusader. I was an older woman with a filing system and a difficult year and an ability to explain things clearly, offering what I had to people who needed it. That was all it was, and that was enough. That is, in fact, exactly how most useful things in the world get done, not through transformation, but through one person with something specific to offer, making it available to people who need it. The restitution payments from Caleb continued to arrive, through Margaret's office, on the schedule that had been ordered. The criminal investigation regarding the broader circumstances of the document fraud was still unresolved as of late September. These things moved slowly, as I had been warned they would, and I had made my peace with the uncertainty of it, or was in the process of making my peace with it, which is as close as you generally get. Margaret called me in late September with a final update on the Graydon case. He had accepted a plea agreement, a formal conviction, a period of probation, a permanent bar from any future notarial or legal adjacent work, and a financial penalty. He would not go to prison. I had expected to feel more about that than I did. What I felt was, again, the word appropriate. The word that meant a thing had been correctly labeled and correctly filed and could now be put in the right folder. On an October afternoon, I drove past the house where Caleb and Vanessa were now living in an apartment complex on the east side of town, a modern building with a parking garage and a lobby with potted plants. I had not gone there deliberately. I had been running errands, and the route home took me past it. I slowed slightly, not stopped, just slowed and looked at the building and thought, this is where my son lives now, in an apartment he is renting, having lost the house he tried to steal from his mother. I did not feel triumphant. I felt, honestly, sad in a way that surprised me with its depth, the particular sadness of seeing a life that went wrong in a direction it was never supposed to go, of knowing that the person inside that apartment had made choices that cost him the relationship with his mother and the respect of people who knew him and the comfortable life he had been trying to build on a foundation of someone else's sacrifice. That was not a life I wished on him. That was a consequence he had built with his own decisions, and the difference between a consequence and a punishment is that a consequence doesn't require anyone to want it for you. It simply follows from what was done. I drove home. November arrived, and with it, the particular quality of light that northeastern falls specialize in, low and amber and slightly melancholy, the kind that makes everything look like a memory of itself. Put the garden to bed for the winter. I covered the rose bushes the way Robert had taught me, with burlap and stakes, protecting what needed protecting, so it could survive what was coming and return in the spring. I stood in the backyard in the November light with dirt on my gloves and my breath fogging in the cold air, and I looked at my house from the outside, the white siding, the dark shutters, the warm light coming through the kitchen window. The house that had been mine and had been taken and had been returned, and was now mine again in a way that was different from before, because now I had fought for it, and I knew what it had cost, and I knew what I was capable of spending to protect it. I thought about what I wanted the next chapter to look like. Not 5 years from now or 10 years from now, just the next chapter. Coming winter and spring. Renata was talking about coming at Christmas. The Wednesday evening group continued. Patricia Osi and I were meeting monthly now, and my financial affairs were in better order than they had been. In years structured carefully, documented fully, with no access granted to anyone whose interests were not identical to mine. The basement had its new light, and its cleared floor, and its small memorial corner, and I had taken to writing down there, sometimes in the evenings, And it had become, improbably, the room in the house where I felt most like myself, the most integrated version of myself, the one that had been through something and come out the other side, carrying everything she'd brought in and a few things she'd acquired along the way. I do not have a tidy conclusion for you. I want to be honest about that. The story does not end with everything resolved and all parties at peace and the protagonist standing in golden light with no remaining complications. That is not what real life serves you, and I have stopped pretending to want it. What I have is my house, my name on the deed, my locks on the doors. I have a niece who calls every week and a neighbor who brings me zucchini from her garden. I have a Wednesday evening group and a legitimate financial advisor and an attorney I trust and a 14-page timeline that I am keeping in a folder in the study, not because I need it anymore, but because it represents something I am not willing to put away entirely. I have my filing system. I have my school teacher handwriting. I have a basement with a warm light and an old cot in one corner and a new notebook on the shelf beside it. And I have the thing that was always mine and that no document, however cleverly prepared, however many times I was pointed to a signature line and told just here, and we'll get out of your way the thing that was always mine, and that no one, in the end, had managed to take. My own clear mind, my own history, my own knowledge of what I had built and what it was worth and what I was willing to do to keep it. I went inside out of the November cold. I pulled off my gloves and washed my hands at the kitchen sink and filled the kettle and set it on the stove. While I waited for it to boil, I stood at the window and looked out at the backyard, the covered rose bushes along the fence, the bare garden beds, the old iron table where Dolores and I had sat in July with our tea. The kettle began to whistle. I made my tea. I took it to the kitchen table and I sat down and I drank it in the warm quiet of my own kitchen, in my own house, on my own terms. Outside, the November light was going the way November light goes fast, and without apology, leaving the yard in a blue-gray dusk that was cold and clear and entirely itself. I sat there until the cup was empty. Then I got up and I started dinner, and the evening continued the way evenings do, one moment into the next, ordinary and sufficient and entirely, completely mine.